She stepped down from the railcar with her trunk and a single wool shawl, the sun striking the dust so that it rose in slow gold clouds around her boots. Hannah Campbell had crossed a continent for a promise she had not been allowed to inspect with her own eyes, a name scrawled in a glossy advertisement, and a handful of letters that had sounded, at least on paper, like safety. She had left a small house in Boston, a ledger of schoolchildren's names in her head, and a barrel of hope that the man who had written, "Yours, James," would be waiting on the platform. Instead, the town they called Sylvage met her with a silence that seemed to answer every question. The stationmaster, a man whose face had been weathered by both sun and small cruelties, watched her as if he were cataloguing her fear. He did not raise his hat. "Miss Campbell?" he asked, as if the name were a thing to be verified. When she confirmed, he folded his hands on the counter and said, without preamble or softening, "There's been an accident. James Blackwell, he didn't live through the fever. Folks around here are saying he rode out sick and never came back." The words did not carry the drama of tragedy. They landed like stones that interrupted the life she had carried within her chest. 3,000 miles from Boston, with a single trunk and a handful of letters, Hannah felt the world tilt. There was no family to call, no husband, no warm hearth to shelter a trembling heart. The platform smelled of coal and horses. The bench she had sat on seemed suddenly unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else's life. Someone should have offered comfort. Instead, townsfolk turned away or looked with the particular curiosity reserved for people whose misfortune makes the comfortable feel grateful for their own small securities. Hannah's breath was a thin thing. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the trunk until the knuckles blanched. She did not know where to go. She could not even say the name of the house that had been promised to her, only that it lay somewhere near the Sullivan Ranch outside of town. He noticed because she did not belong to that place, because her posture carried the unfamiliar plainness of a woman who had been schooled to be useful rather than conspicuous, and because her face, under the bruising of shock, had the kind of small, careful expression that only those who teach retain when frightened. Colton Sullivan came into the station with the slow gait of a man used to reading land and weather, his hat in his hand, sleeves rolled where they had been soaked in a morning's work. He had meant to send a wagon for a letterer at the depot and to be on his way. What made him stop was not a sense of romance, but a practical itch. There was trouble, and it was the sort he did not ignore. He watched Hannah for a full, quiet beat and, without theatrics, crossed the platform. "You look like you've been told the world's done you wrong," he said, his voice a low baritone that blended with the creak of the station's timber. It was not a question so much as an observation. The stationmaster repeated his news. Hannah's face crumpled in an instant that felt like being dropped through air. "James is dead," she said, the sentence coming out like a report on someone else's misfortune. She listened to the word as if it were foreign. The letters, the plans, the steady kindness of imagined hands, everything she had folded and stored for the years to come, fell away. On the platform, with the prairie wind threading through the posts of the depot, she felt suddenly and terrifyingly alone. Colton looked at her as if searching for what to do with a human life that had been unmoored. He did not offer a sermon or a platitude. He lifted his hat with a motion that was at once respectful and practical. "I'm Colton Sullivan," he said. "My sister runs a boarding house in town. You'll not be expected to make yourself a burden there. If you want, you can come with me now. There'll be food and a bed and time to figure the next step." Hannah's first instinct was to refuse. Pride was not a small thing for a woman who had taught children how to form their letters and how to stand again when they tumbled. But the refusal died against the sharpness of the facts. She had little money. The nearest kin were thousands of miles away, and the western plains were not kind to someone without a plan. She looked at the man who had offered the help, whose coat was plain and whose eyes carried both work-weariness and a careful, watchful steadiness, and felt, in a place she thought might be shame or might be trust, the beginning of acceptance. "Only until I can decide what to do," she said. "I don't want to trouble." "No trouble," Colton answered. "My sister's boarding house is honest, and will have you no more than a week if you don't like it. You'll have a room and supper. My sister Sarah keeps an eye on folks. Come along." He took the trunk and led the way. On the walk to town they passed a line of buildings that looked as if they'd been cut out of the prairie itself, low, deliberate things, then a stretch of open sky that made Hannah's chest ache with a new kind of loneliness. Colton did not talk much beyond necessary directions. When he did, his words were plain and anchored in particulars. Where the boarding house sat, where the blacksmith shop kept its horses, which tavern had a piano in the corner. The small reporting of his town steadied her. Small facts steadied one who had just been told a man to marry was dead. After they had settled at Sarah's, amid a boiled dinner and a bed that creaked with the comfort of familiarity, Hannah lay awake and considered the thinness of her options. The city she had left had been tidy and constrained. Here everything bent to the horizon and to what one could cultivate from land and sweat. The loneliness was a presence, but she had already decided, while her mind still hummed with the sound of rails, that she would not be carried by pity. She had lessons in her knapsack. She had hands that knew how to stitch and how to keep account. She had the kind of resolve that arises slowly, not from drama but from a habit of doing. If you want to know whether she stays, keep watching. The next morning Colton came by the boarding house before the sun had burned the dew from the porch. He did not appear in any grand fashion. He came as men do who are used to the early light, acknowledging people with nods and small talk. He found Hannah sitting on the back step, elbows on her knees, watching a dog chase the tail of morning. He waited a moment without speaking, then said simply, "There's a place for work at our ranch. My house needs a hand with the books and the inside of things. My sister keeps the place respectable. I can pay for your passage back east if it proves a poor fit after 30 days. You'd have room, board and wages, no strings. If you accept, you'd be telling me plainly you made a choice." It was as if he had taken the uncertain fact of her arrival and offered the only useful alternatives, help that preserved dignity, or the long loneliness of trying to make a life out of nothing. The terms he laid out mattered. He spoke of wages, of a month's trial, and of paid passage home. The clarity of it made the offer not charity, but a proposition she could weigh. Hannah considered what such practicality meant. Her education could be useful. Barns needed order. Ledgers needed tending. "Why help me?" she asked. It was not a bitter question. It was the question of someone born to skepticism and refined by necessity. Colton paused by the fence and looked out to the east, where the land stretched like a promise and like the place where many promises were tested. "My father would have helped anyone in need if he could," he said. "I've got a place to spare. Folks do what they can. If I turned away someone who needed a hand, I'd sleep poor for it." Hannah nodded. It was a modest reason, but reason enough. She was not a stranger to the idea of mutual aid disguised as common sense. She agreed with a firmness that surprised her, not because she expected romance or a comfortable life, but because the offer was honest and because she had decided she would choose safety by her own measure. Her acceptance was not resignation. It was a deliberate maneuver toward the future. Colton kept his word. He gave her room in the ranch house, a small south-facing chamber with a window that caught the sun in the afternoons and a cot lined with a quilt Sarah had mended more times than Hannah could count. He paid her a reasonable wage, enough that she could have saved something if she kept to frugality, and he promised that if after 30 days she wanted to return east, he would see her on the stage with money enough to carry her back. The ranch breathed like a living thing. Horses snorting in the corral, cattle lowing across ditches, the wide expanse of sky making every task seem smaller and grander at once. Hannah set about her duties as she might a classroom, tidy, patient, and with a sense of order. She sorted receipts and bills in a neat line upon Colton's kitchen table, accounted for hay and feed, and corrected previous errors born of neglect rather than malice. She planted a small kitchen garden by the back door, coaxing beans and beets through the soil. The act of pressing seeds into earth felt like stamping a promise. Work was steady, and it made room for conversation of a particular kind, the kind that began in the hands and widened into the heart. She taught the children who tread the ranch's paths how to form their letters in spare evenings, gathering them at the long kitchen table with a slate and chalk. Miguel and Diego, the ranch hands, watched with something like amusement at first, then with real admiration as the children learned to write their names and read aloud. The men were patient and skilled in tasks of rope and hoof. Hannah respected them and expected the same. Their respect was returned. Colton kept a careful distance at first. He did not impose himself. He offered solitude and steadiness in equal measure. He was present on the edges of her life like a fence, there to mark boundaries and to hold in what mattered. He would ride out at dawn and return with the weather on his shoulders. Once, when a thunderstorm had burst sudden and heavy, he knocked at the back door, having come to make sure the kitchen stove's chimney was properly cleared. Their conversations were practical at first, about stock and grain and the village market, but in the small spaces of chores and meals, they spoke of life. "What did you teach in Boston?" Colton asked one evening as they ate stew by lamplight. "Reading and simple arithmetic," Hannah said, "and how to read a map of the sky, boys and girls both. It seemed the only way to keep them steady." "You ever think of teaching out here?" he asked. He might as well have asked whether she fancied staying forever, but he framed it in the plainness he trusted. She looked up at him. "I think of many things. I did not expect to farm for a living when I left Boston, but there are seeds I've planted that I did not know I possessed. Teaching seems like the sort of seed that goes well with a hungry land." Their closeness grew in the shape of daily things. Colton would hand her a cup of coffee in the morning and not speak of himself until she had had 2 sips. He helped with the heavy lifting, bales of hay and sacks of feed, without making a show of it. He watched her tend the garden with a small private concern. When a wind whipped the shutters loose one afternoon and slammed them like 2 hands clapping in a panic, he was there to assist her as if it were no bother, though his visiting had cost him time in the saddle. There were moments of tenderness that were careful rather than dramatic. On a blustery autumn evening, he offered to ride her into town so she could settle a bewildering payroll dispute with the bank. She climbed into the saddle with a modest trepidation. She had ridden before, but never as the townspeople's eyes meant. The land rolled under them, dunes of grass and little river gullies. The ride carried them out beyond the quiet of chores and into the panorama where the world felt like a mapped page. Colton pointed to a low rise ahead where one could see the valley and the distant cattle fencing like lines on a ledger. "Up there," he said. "People say it's good to look from a height when you can't make a choice." They sat on the rise while the sun moved toward the west. The prairie seemed to puff and breathe around them, and Hannah felt a clarity she rarely allowed herself. They did not speak much. The shared silence was companionable. Colton's hand, when it brushed against hers to steady her as she dismounted, was deliberate and careful. No claim, only support. That quiet intimacy deepened over months. Winter taught them the virtues of closeness. One night, a storm roared across the plains with such violence that the power of the wind seemed to protest the world's very edges. Rain hammered the roof. The house creaked as if it were only a great living chest. They were forced indoors in a way that made proximity inevitable. Miguel and Diego had tied the horses and made sure the fences were secure. The children were sent to bed early with a bowl of porridge. The lamplight was kept low. Colton sat near the hearth, and Hannah read aloud from a book of poems she had carried west because, even at the brink of poverty, she had never thought a poem an unnecessary burden. The words became a hearth of their own. The storm roared, but within the kitchen the voice of the book and the steadiness of their breathing braided together. Colton's presence was a slow, steady warmth, a hand on the back of the chair, a look that said, without speech, "I am here." He asked about Boston in the way a man asks about a country he has never seen but wishes to understand. Hannah told him about narrow rooms and winter mornings when the snow came down and the children's laughter was the only heat. She told him, too, the truth that had shadowed her. That she had come west not because she fancied the prairie, but because the marriage had seemed a path to something safer than waiting tables or taking in sewing for strangers. He listened as if every detail mattered. When she told him how she had been taught to keep books and how tidy sums had given her a small order to life, a curious thing happened. Colton's brow softened, and he admitted, one of the rare confessions he made, how his father had died owing more than he left, and how Colton had meant to keep the ranch from slipping into the hands of the bank. He confessed to sleeping poorly some nights because ledgers and debts were like animals that came to break down the door. "Why didn't you sell?" Hannah asked, more an offer to understand than a challenge. "That land's more than value to me," Colton said simply. "It's where my folks came from. It's where I learned the measure of a man. Selling would be easy. Keeping is harder and worth the work if it means our children have a place to start." Their shared aims revealed a compatibility that was practical and tender. As the months moved, the small things turned into a conversation of life. He respected her skill at numbers and the neatness of her plans. She found in him a man who would not take advantage of someone vulnerable, but who would share the burden of work. He paid her wages with a hand that was never too heavy nor too light. He never made a joke of her being a mail-order bride. He saw instead a woman who had arrived terrified and remained resolute. There were tests. Once an accident befell a horse, and Colton's temper flared for the briefest of moments, bright and scary as a summer lightning strike. He apologized afterward with a letter-sized patience, speaking plainly about the fear of losing an animal, and the ways men sometimes misplace sorrow in anger. Hannah, for her part, did not bleach her own fears, but named them. She spoke of nights she lay awake thinking she had made a mistake, of a life as a spinster teacher in Boston that would have spared her the hunger of uncertainty. Their conversations were often small reconciliations, a pot of stew that had been over-seasoned, an apology for a thoughtless word, a day when the fences had to be mended, and neither of them pretended it was work for the opposite sex. One afternoon, after a spring that had been both generous with rain and fickle with wind, Colton took her to that same rise at the boundary of their fields. He had gone there as a boy with his father to learn the lay of the land. Now he went with a steadier reason. They sat and watched the cattle like slow, floating fortunes, and he turned to her with a gravity that felt like the wind before a storm. "I've been thinking about the place I want to leave," he said. "Not just the house or the corrals, but what stays. My father had a lot of sayings that were crude but honest. One of them was that a man builds nothing by wanting it in his head alone. He wanted someone beside him who'd share the burdens and the days." Hannah listened. When he spoke of burdens, it was not the sort of language that sought to possess. He spoke of partnership. He told her plainly he believed she was as much a fit for that partnership as any woman plain or fair. He did not ask immediately. He did not kneel and protest. He offered instead a future made of steady things, shared accounts, a house with a hearth, children taught to read their names at the long kitchen table. His words were a weaving together of hope and practicality. "Hannah," he said, "I want you to stay, not to be kept, but to be my partner, to marry me." It was not a proposal given in a flourish. It was a statement, a clear plan handed to her in a voice as plain and inevitable as the light. She saw in that moment the life that had been hinted at since the station, safety woven with a kind of daily joy, the honor of work shared, the possibility of children who would know both the book and the plow. Her heart answered in a way that was not the feverish romance of novels, but the deep, surprising bloom of a seed that had been watered. "I will stay," she said, "if you will allow me to help carry things I can carry." He took her hand then, not as a demand but as a joining, and there on the rise under the vast sky they made the quiet decision to build a life together. The wedding was modest, held in the little church with whitewashed walls, whose minister had once presided over Colton's father's funeral. The town turned out with pies and candles, and village gossip softened by the hymn. Hannah wore a dress she had mended twice and a ribbon that Sarah had found at the back of a drawer. Colton stood straight and awkward in a jacket that did not quite fit. They exchanged vows that were unadorned and earnest. There was gratitude in their joining, a sense that two sturdy things had come together to make something stronger. Their married life did not dissolve into uninterrupted ease. It was lived in the ledger of small decisions: where to allocate funds for seed, when to hire an extra hand to help with lambing, whether to mend a fence at once or wait until the payoff from a good sale materialized. When spring brought a sickness through the calves, the community came together, the midwife and the minister and Maria from the general store, who had known better to bring hot teas and common sense. Maria's hands were steady. She did not speak in grand phrases. When Hannah found herself heavy with a child in the next year, it was Maria's cool voice that steadied her, and the town's midwife who tended her with skill and a soothing hand. Clara Sarah Sullivan arrived on an April morning that smelled of cut grass and rain-washed hay. Hannah held her and felt a tether tighten that was both fierce and tender. Colton, for his part, kissed the child's small forehead, as if blessing the land itself. Clara's existence bound them in a new way, not just as companions but as parents, with responsibilities that made their decisions weightier and their late evenings richer for the small voices that breathed in the night. The ranch grew in the ways that mattered, not simply in cattle numbers, but in the kinds of security that make a family dare to plant an orchard. Hannah, whose fingers had been taught to count and measure, kept the books with a precision that turned debts into manageable promises. She argued gently with Colton when his impulse was to spend on a new fence without the savings to back it. They had once a moment of near crisis when the bank pressed for payment on Samuel Hart's promissory note, a neighbor who had mortgaged his fields and then gone ill. The banker came to the house with a ledger's heavy manner that made it clear he expected them to flinch. "We aren't a bank," Colton said firmly. "We're a ranch. We'll meet our obligations, but we won't buy our neighbor's bad management and make it ours to bear." Hannah added her sense of prudence, and together they found not a way to avoid debt, but to face it. They bought a small parcel of neighboring land that summer, a stretch of acreage that would allow them to rotate pastures and to sow an apple orchard. It was a gamble, and the banker's brow creased at the signature on the deed, but it was also an act of vision. They borrowed, yes, but they borrowed with a plan, as Hannah had taught the children in her Boston classrooms, one that balanced seeds and harvest, time and toil. Their neighbors helped where they could. Sarah's boarding house became a place where children of the town learned to read. Hannah opened a small schoolroom in the extra parlor, drawing pupils from the ranches within easy trot. Miguel and Diego, who had been skeptical of the new woman who arrived terrified, became the quiet sort of friends whose loyalty is proven in the seasons. They taught Colton to mend a fence in the old ways, while he taught them the names of the stars when night fell, and a rest could be spared. There were hardships, winters that shrank provisions, and summers when drought caught their hay close. But the pattern of their days made a resilience that was not glamorous but durable. They preserved a modest hay reserve, taught the children to stitch and to read, and invested in a small schoolhouse that Hannah spearheaded. The schoolhouse needed lumber, and the town's congregation raised the money in small portions, $12 here, a pair of overalls there. When the schoolhouse opened with a bell that pealed like a small triumph, it was because the town had decided education was worth the sacrifice. The community that had first watched Hannah like a curiosity now embraced her as a centerpiece of common life. People came with recipes and to trade eggs for butter. The minister became an ally who would drop by to offer a steady word rather than a sermon. He was a man who believed in providence, but also in doing the math honestly and paying the debts by the calendar. He married them, baptized Clara, and in the quiet of many Sundays, when the congregation sang a hymn about the harvest, Hannah would think of the way a life is a sequence of small, ordered things, each one contributing to growth. Colton did not change into a different man. He became more himself. He was still the kind of man who rose at dawn and whose hands bore the seams of honest labor. But he softened in the ways a long marriage will. His laugh came easier, his tenderness more unguarded. He called Hannah by pet names she would not have expected when she first arrived, names born not of possessiveness but of affection, and he showed his care in practical ways. Mending a broken slat on the porch, waking early to fetch water when the well pump was slow, bringing a warm cloth to her when the spring wind bit unexpectedly. There were tender scenes that came to feel like ordinary miracles. Once, when Clara was small and feverish, Hannah sat by her bedside and sang the lullabies she had learned as a child in Boston. Colton, who had never learned many songs, stood just outside the door and listened, hands folded, as if prayerless gratitude could be measured in the way one stays near a sleeping child. On nights like that, the house seemed to contract and then to expand, a small unit of heat in the wide prairie, vigorous and breathing. Years passed in the work of living. The ranch prospered in the slow way of patient planting and attention. Miguel married a woman from the town and set up his own small plot. Diego took the position of head hand, steady and capable. Sarah, who had always had a sharp tongue for gossip and a soft heart for the needy, continued to run the boarding house with a particular brand of firmness that made strangers feel both watched and welcomed. Clara grew, as children do, into a small amalgam of her mother and father. Her mother's precision with a slate and her father's steady fearlessness when approaching a horse. The orchard, which they had planted in hope rather than expectation, took root, and in a late summer, the trees bore apples ripe and honest. They sold a crate at the town market and used the money to repair the schoolhouse roof, an exchange that felt less like financial movement and more like a circulation of goodwill. The children chanted their letters in a room whose bell had once been rented. Their laughter was the new kind of music that stitched the place together. In one of the quiet autumns, when the light lay long and low over the fields and the cattle had been shorn for the season, Colton brought Hannah back to the rise where he had first asked her to stay. They had sat there before, had spoken of land and debt, of children and bread, but this time he carried with him a small polished thing in his palm. The world around them seemed less raw and more like a finished piece of handiwork. They watched a plowman cut neat furrows in the field below, the movement like agenda and prayer sewn into the soil. "Hannah," he said. The name felt like the first syllable of a long sentence, an incantation of all they had lived. "We've built more than I thought I could, more than the ledgers ever promised. You made it possible." She reached for him and took his hand, feeling the roughness of his work and the gentleness beneath. When he rose to his knees and offered a ring that had been forged from a coin and a small unadorned gold that the banker had once called an oddity, it was not the trappings that mattered so much as the fact of being asked again. He was not asking for possession, but for the continued agreement of a life shared. "Yes," she said without hesitation. The answer carried the gravity of all the mornings they had risen together and all the nights they had kept watch. They married again before their small circle, not because vows had been forgotten, but because the act of promising was rich and renewing. Their children, eventually 2 more after Clara, grew accustomed to the rhythms of labor and reading, of church bells and hoeing rows. The little ones learned to count by the beats of a milking stool and to spell by the names of seeds. Hannah taught the wider community. The schoolhouse expanded, and when the district finally sent a teacher with credentials to take over the classroom, Hannah did not feel slighted. She had, in a quiet way, done what she had set out to do, given the children a foundation. Time, which had once been a thing that made Hannah tremble with its uncertainty, became an ally. The years had rounded the sharp edges of shock and replaced them with a deep domestic peace that was not the same as ease. It was made of careful work and of choices taken at dawn and at dusk. The harvests were no longer solely a matter of luck, but of patterns learned and passed down. The bank, which had once nose-breathed at Colton in thin patience, accepted the mortgage repayments with the kind of grudging respect only good work can buy. When Hannah and Colton stood on the rise at the end, years later, Clara grown and with a small child of her own in her arms, the sight of the homestead below was a map of their life. Little hands ran over the fence rails where the children used to practice climbing. The apple trees were full and slightly gnarled with fruit. The schoolhouse chimed. Miguel's laughter came across the yard where he showed his own children how to throw a rope. They watched as a distant storm moved over the land and dissolved into rain, the water like a blessing that had no words but many effects. Hannah looked at Colton as he watched the field and felt the strange, soft recognition of a life that had once been a single day's terror and had become a tapestry. She remembered the platform where the stationmaster's words had been a blow, where the world had seemed to end in a single sentence, and she thought of the moment Colton had simply noticed that something was wrong and chosen to do the right thing. That noticing had changed everything. It had provided the small hinge upon which their life turned. They had not been saved by grand providence alone. They had been saved by a sequence of deliberate choices. His to offer shelter, in a way that respected her agency. Hers to accept work and to invest herself in the life they could build. They had chosen trust and continued to choose it, day by day. Their home had become a place where seeds turned to fruit and where a frightened traveler found in time a family. At the edge of the rise, Colton adjusted his hat and took Hannah's hand. The wind took seed pods and carried them like questions. Hannah smiled with a soft, steady joy that had been carved from the years of simple things, teaching a child to read, planting a tree, mending a roof. She thought of James as a name that had once been an answer and now was only a turning point. That loss had been a cruel note in the score of her life, but it had, in a strange moral geometry, left space for a different melody. They stayed where they were, watching their children play and the harvest come in. The homestead flourished, not in extravagance, but in substance. A schoolhouse that meant children learned to shape their futures. A ranch that meant work and hospitality. A community stitched with the small trusts of others' help. Hannah's life was no longer the precariousness she had felt on that platform. It was a rooted thing, welded by sweat and gentleness. And so, years after the mail car's whistle and the stationmaster's blunt news, Hannah and Colton stood on the rise once more. She had arrived alone and terrified. He had noticed something was wrong and had done what he could. Together they had built a home that fed, taught, and sheltered. In the shadow of the orchard, they watched the next generation run, their laughter a living answer to the earlier silence, and felt a quiet gratitude that had nothing to do with miracles and everything to do with steady human kindness. If this story has touched you, consider liking and subscribing to hear more tales of hope and quiet courage.